I would like to turn this meeting over to Dr. Jean Jennings on the beacon light. It's all yours, Jean.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And let's just kind of dive right in. I mean, basically what we're looking at are the articles. There are 7 of them that HPB wrote on the beacon light of the unknown, or the beacon light of truth, or the beacon light of the unknown and its truth, or the beacon light of the unknown truth and its nature. And all of those are little plays on words, but they reflect mainly what's in these 7 little chapters, I would say. They total somewhere around 30 something pages. And each of them deal with different aspects of the teaching. And so what we've done is kind of broken it down into about 5 different sections that just highlight certain overall topics. And then hopefully in questions and answers, we can drill down into the details if you'd like. The articles were written for a particular reason, and HPB tells us that in the very last article, number 7, that she wrote, and she says here, the opening lines, "We hope that we have by this time sufficiently refuted in these pages several grave misconceptions of our doctrine and beliefs. That amongst others which insist in regarding theosophists, those at least who have founded the society as polytheist or atheist. We are neither one or other any more than certain Gnostics were." And so really what she does in 1 through 7 is takes us on a tour. And so the first part of that tour, she doesn't do in this particular order, but after reading it, this is the order that we decided to put it in. The first has to do with the origin of the teachings of theosophy. Theosophy is considered to be, as all of you know, godlike wisdom, or wisdom that is available to those individuals that have reached a godlike status. In theosophy, especially in the Mahatma letters, they refer to these particular beings in, I guess, a unique way. And HPB does that in her dialogues as well. And they refer to them as either planetary spirits in the highest sense, or returning Nirmanakayas from previous Manvantaras or previous planetary systems. Now, that in and of itself should really disturb anyone's mindset when we think about how many millions of years we're talking about being present or being alive. And so there have to be many questions. What can live that long? What would be the state of the nature of such a being wherein that type of data, information, or knowledge could be retained and readily accessible and given as a unique vibration to the entire humanity that was about to take birth on a new planet. And she tells us that this particular process happens all the time, anytime a planetary system goes either asleep or out of manifest existence. There are those that are symbolically the Noah arks of humankind or sentient life, and they carry the seeds as well as the knowledge for replanting all of that in the new system. And so included in those seeds, we have to ask ourselves, again, what is the nature of all souls? that can be kept as seeds, preserved, and in what nature they would be preserved, such that they could be replanted in quotes and awakened to continue their ongoing progress and evolutionary development. Nonetheless, she says, those are the beings that have the heart of the wisdom embodied within their natures. Now, the wisdom that they periodically give out, again, has been titled Theosophy this time around, as it relates to HPB's representation of that. But she tells us that there have been in the first, second, and part of the third articles a number of names that have been used. And under this category, we can look at names, states of consciousness, types of knowledge, and individuals that have achieved those states. And so when she gives us the broad spectrum of names that have been used throughout time for the accumulation, the aggregate body of that wisdom. And again, if we think of one of her footnotes, I believe it's in the Key to Theosophy, she speaks about the aggregate wisdom of all of the Dhyanis as being that prajna that is Ishvara, and their individual wisdom being unique individual prajna pertaining to each of those. And so in this case, we're talking about the complete body of knowledge and wisdom that is possible to any entity that can achieve that particular state. And before we just mention some of the names that she mentioned, we have to acknowledge that she says there are two ways to look at this wisdom. One is that it can never, ever, ever, ever be expressed in its complete, whole, integral nature on earth. So that even implies that theosophy, as we typically have it, is not the total package. And so we have to be humble. We have to leave room for greater truths that even upset our truth as we understand it. Not that the truth won't be true, but the way that we have interpreted it may be totally false. And so she tells us that the absolute wisdom, the absolute knowledge is something that can never be fit into time and space. Its nature, similar to the first fundamental proposition, is boundless, and yet it's perceptible. The second aspect of that, and most again have heard of this, relative knowledge. And that is the knowledge that expresses itself through the dichotomy of duality. And whenever we have duality, there can be no right or no absolute wrong, but only relative truths, relative rights, relative wrongs, depending on conditions, timetables, rounds, races, and degrees of awakening. And so even that type of knowledge can be challenging. And so we shouldn't be dogmatic about embracing any of it. Now, she says the branches of approach or the branches of wisdom that have been named that lead to this truth. And she says distinctly, theosophy is a path that leads to truth. It may be godlike wisdom, but it leads to the truth that is inherent within anyone's religion, path, search, spiritual goals. So again, it is something that prepares us in a certain way to receive that which is already present. But she says those individuals that reach states of samadhi, can claim that. And we have to be careful with these terms because individuals describe these and define these differently, and rightfully so, depending upon the context and the system that they're being used in. So she uses samadhi as the ultimate and the sunam bonum, whereas others will look at it as regarding stages of samadhi, for instance, in Patanjali's. She talks about the wisdom religion, again, a term everyone is familiar with, the ancient doctrines, the occult wisdom, the esoteric wisdom. She speaks about the Gnostics and their gnosis. She speaks about the wisdoms that are contained in the alchemical teachings, in the Kabbalistic teachings, in the Rosicrucian teachings, in the Hermetic teachings, those that are contained in degree in Jakob Burma's presentation, some of which have been included in Emanuel Swedenborg's, I believe, rendition, although that has been totally overlaid, as she says, with Christian terminology and interpretations. And that brings up another point that she brings out, that even the exposure and the awakening to the perceptive truths that stand beyond cognitive understanding in the moment that they are perceived need to be properly interpreted. And that proper interpretation typically can only be performed through initiation. And that process of initiation is tied into that process of the occult pursuit as well as the esoteric pursuit. She speaks about, well, let me switch gears for a moment, because T. Subbarao talks about the epitome of this wisdom from his Advaita viewpoint. And these are contained in what he calls the teachings on Parabrahm, the macrocosm, the microcosm, the systems of yoga that embrace the Sankhya system, Raja Yoga, Charaka Yoga, and Hatha Yoga, interestingly enough. He speaks about the relationships that exist between the macrocosm and the microcosm as it relates to the powers and the forces that have to be understood. He then speaks about the wisdom that is contained in the Kuala teachings, the Shiva Agamas, and the Sakti Agamas, all aspects of how we approach these teachings and the information in the beginning that they provide for us that we can dwell on, hopefully turn into knowledge, and eventually realize as wisdom. And he goes on to mention the Vedas, the system of Pranava, which is an occult system that has to do with the, you might say, ultimate breath of life. And then those that are related to the Shishrakram system. And that is a system that pertains to the psychophysiology of a being, as well as that of perhaps a globe, as well as that of a system. And then we are looking at other systems. Again, the Kabbalah she speaks about the Gnostics that are truly a good representation of the Eastern teachings as put forth by those true planetary beings that set the keynote for the evolutionary process. She then goes on to explain that there are individuals that have also achieved these states. Some of the, again, many of the names that you would know: Ammoniusakis, Iamblichus, Hermes, Enoch, Orpheus, Zoroaster, Plato, Pythagoras, obviously the Buddha, Lao Tse, the Tsongkhapas of the world in their different incarnations, the Nagarjunas that pertain to those systems, the Atishas that pertain to those systems, and how they have expressed these teachings both East and West, not to mention the entire Tibetan Buddhist corpus of what she calls esoteric knowledge. And so there is the system, there is the study of that system, the initiation into that system, and the individuals that have mastered in degrees aspects of those systems that she gives in these articles as being holders of that torch of truth, that beacon light that is spoken about, that points to the unknown darkness of our own beings, as well as of universal being. She then goes to say that in the world of theosophy, minimally speaking, there are two kinds of theosophists that study these teachings. And there are true theosophists in that regards and false theosophists. The false theosophists, she says, are the white ants of the society. They eat away at the roots. They destroy the teachings. They are only really concerned about themselves, about their egos, about their pride, about their positions, and about their appearance of understanding such that they can lead others and manipulate their minds. She says, those types of individuals, if you confront them and tell them that they are misrepresenting the teachings or they don't understand the teachings, are the very ones that are going to, in essence, bite off your head and tell you that you don't know what you're talking about. And if it wasn't for them, theosophy wouldn't be in existence. And she had encountered individuals like that during her time. And obviously, there are still individuals like that now. Then she says there are true theosophists, or those that are at least truer in their pursuits, in their devotions, in their attempts to understand. And so she says, when they approach theosophy from several different angles. There is theosophy as a philosophy to study, to understand, and to, for instance, embrace and digest the secret doctrine as related to the ideas that it contains regarding cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis, and then the basic works that she has in her articles, since we're doing the ULT dance, what Judge has in his articles. And she says, most importantly, a theosophist will live according to that second object. They will look at sciences, philosophies, and religions. They will compare them. They will analyze them. They will segregate out what's right and what's wrong. They will fit in the missing pieces. They will be humble. And above all, they will be altruistic, which then brings us to that first object of universal brother and sisterhood of all sentient life. Without being an altruism, she says, one has no business truly studying theosophy. And so there are just the basic fundamental principles and philosophical principles of theosophy that we can study. There are those that want to study it because, again, they're devoted, but they also want to share that studying with, as she says in her later article, the masses, because theosophy is for the masses. And so in those basic teachings, we are looking at the three fundamentals. Again, the nature of deity in and out of time and space, the aspect of deity that is boundless and has no relation to anything, to its reflection that creates or generates creatively the conditions through which manifest illusion occurs, that illusion being a reality for anyone that cannot shake themselves of that illusion. And then the idea of law, the idea of karma, cycles, re-embodiment, all of that is, again, simple enough for the masses. And then the idea of spiritual unfolding, i.e. evolution. So those three fundamentals, those three objects are clearly for the practical theosophists that are wanting to teach. She then talks about another set of practical theosophists that want to, again, set the example. And these are those that have a sense of duty to humanity. They work on self-sacrifice. They work on minimizing and getting rid of this elusive thing that we call personality, ego, pride, and I. And they work on charity, as well as being a living example of the teachings that they would try to embody through understanding. She then says there's another set of theosophists that are even more devoted and involved. And again, they can just be put in that category of those that would want to be occultist, those that would want to study or truly experience without knowing what it is, the esoteric side of this entire philosophy and teaching, as expressed in gnosis, as expressed in divine wisdom, as expressed in the wisdom religion. And those that are completely so consumed that they are fully devotional to all aspects of this process. And then she tells us that in, I think it's a part of second article going into the third, that there are the critics of theosophy. And again, she tells us there are two types. One is the critic that, like the theosophist who wants to be all, says they know all, and gets offended when you point out that they've made an error. The critics that know nothing about theosophy. They are biased, they are prejudiced, they are ignorant about its teachings, they are ignorant about its universal nature. They can't read beyond the words. They do not know how to interpret the symbols, and they are simply denying and poo-pooing and saying that theosophy has no value and there are no such things as powers and spirit and soul. And again, we've got that same dialogue going on nowadays. She says, that's bad enough, but the fact that they haven't even opened up the books to study them before they open their mouth is a grave sin. And then she says there's the other critic that is, in a sense, a friend of theosophy. And that's the critic that has gone through the teachings, that does ask disturbing questions, that does try to point out the incongruities that they seem to experience in the teachings. They compare the teachings. Again, they analyze the teachings. They point out the gaps. They point out the inconsistencies. And yet, in all of that, they then seek for the truth. And in seeking for the truth, they try to fill the gaps themselves that they're pointing out that they find are missing or that they think are incorrect, etc. And then they bring it back. And they don't deny it, but they try to improve it. And she says these were the real critics of the old days that took the time to really study, understand, and experience, and then brought up what they felt were the weaknesses and the gaps of the issues, but pointed out again, not to get rid of, but to improve the system. And she says that is the same way that the true occultist works. It's not by blind acceptance, but it's by study, it's by understanding, it's by analyzing, it's by comparison, it's by testing experientially what one is presented with, and synthesizing and subsequently improving. Same process in evolution. And so when we look at these, we've got true theosophists that are devoting themselves to that gnosis that is representative of that wisdom, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that has been sent out through that vibrational breath, so to speak, of that planetary spirit at the very beginning of the entire evolutionary cycle. And we've got the critics that are really the friends. And that's why perhaps maybe science might become the best ally, because obviously if they spent the time, they would criticize. But she then tells us in the following section that, like some of the scientists who did criticize and who did study, they might in fact begin to find some of the keys to the mystery language. And she defines that mystery language in broad terms, a mystery language that is still available to the public. And she identifies some of the individuals that caught glimpses of pieces of that as they were studying Egyptology, studying the pyramids, looking at the astronomical ratios that related to the planets and the measurements of the period, looking at the king's chamber, the ascent to the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, and the measurements of all of these. And coming up with a system of measurement that was reflected in the very astrology and astronomy, as well as cosmology of the universe itself, or minimally the solar system that we find ourselves in. And she says that mystery language then, when it's begun to be approached through symbol, and Joseph Campbell literally took that up and published quite a few books on comparative symbology, as some of the others did from the universal perspective. Because she said, very similar to the second object, when we look at the universality of those symbols and we begin to find out their underlying ideology, which is different than their thought processes being expressed on paper, then we can begin to see some of the processes and laws that exist in nature. And this is not necessarily something that you have to be an occultist to do, but you just have to have some inclination and perseveration of intent, persistence, perseverance, in order to understand if you're approaching it in the right spirit. And then she tells us a little bit more about this mystery language and some of the elements or some of the subjects that are involved in there. Again, there was the astronomy, there was the astrology, there was the psychology, there was the geometry, numerology, and ratios, i.e. the mathematics that tied universals to particulars. There was the spiritual end of that, theology, theophany, and the whole gnosis, not to mention the forces and energies that go and are involved in that whole process. That, how can we call it? The term Fohatic as a generic term that embraces all of those life energies. And she made a comment about scientists poo-pooing theosophy without, again, understanding it, independent of the critics that were more related to religion and just didn't want to have any part of this and were very biased, etc. And she said, science, if they are real and true, eventually have to come to the occult sciences, the esoteric truths, because the truth of wisdom pertains to the immutable root of life. And there is nothing that does not express itself through life that we are aware of. And the teachers, even in the Mahatma letters, I believe it is, indicate that they study life. Call it what you want, deity, this, that, or the other, it doesn't matter. It is life manifesting itself under various forms, through various means, expressing its various degrees of perception, consciousness, awareness, and self-reflection. And then she kind of brings all of this together. And although she mentions this in sections 1 and 2, we've left it kind of for the last, because one of the questions always is, well, how do you know all of this? How do you even approach the vastness of these things? We can't do that. We can't know these things. And she says, yes, everyone can. And she says, everyone can simply because everyone is an emanation of deity in their highest, most moral, and intelligible, forceful nature. We are a spark. We are a reflection. Call it what you want. We are that. And she says, that is a divine instinct in the beginning. And yet that instinct can blossom under proper developmental processes. And when it blossoms, it only blossoms through mind, consciousness, and awareness. It's not about feelings. It's not about touch. She says, when we begin to hear through our eyes and see through our hearing, in other words, when the senses are returning into their primal sense and mind has reached its true intuitive state, then that divine intuition can begin to awaken. And very often we talk about intuition as if we understood what that is, but she tells us point blank, intuition has nothing to do with anything on this globe. So if we're talking about intuition about what we're going to do today, or intuition about the stock market, or intuition about what's going to happen in terms of the wars, or any of that nonsense, it has nothing to do with the spiritual nature of our being. And she says it is that divine instinct that turns into a divine intuition that is able through, and Judge uses this term, the highest moral and ethical and intelligible aspect of mind, not cognitive mind, not sensory-based mind, not object-based mind. But there is something else within us that has a modality of perception and awareness that goes beyond our waking states, our sleeping, dreaming states, our deep sleep states, and has a life of its own. And when it is awakened, it, reflecting within, is able to look upon what we simply call the magnificent space, condition, and state of omnificent. And that's not a word that probably anyone has heard because I just made it up. But it's very much like magnificent, but it's omnificent. And the reason why it's omni, because in that Buddhic state is everything. It is beyond omniscience. It is beyond omnipotence. It is beyond omniforms. It is beyond omnipresence, as we are typically used to talking about being here, there. It is beyond dimensionality. And it is beyond dichotomous thinking, obviously. And yet it is experiential. And Judy gave us a vision of that several weeks ago when she gave us that talk, and I forget the exact name of that talk, but it had to do with the gentleman who, in fact, had glimpses of that divine omniscience, and then tried to incorporate it into a social system of types. And again, we can glimpse the totality that is boundless, but only one word is going to come out of our mouth at a time. And once we're using the words, if we say up, someone else can say down. If we say right, someone else can say left. And so explaining it is a waste of time. Not unless, as with the Buddha, when they asked, there was that moment of silence in which two beings resonated as one. And there was direct perception and an appreciation of that which goes beyond words. And yet beyond that is the state of the boundless and that absoluteness that HPB makes reference to, beyond which there is no word or expression that we can use. And so, in short, although there were, again, 30-something pages, and if we read each page, it would be about 3 minutes, 4 minutes to a page, which means it would be longer than an hour. We clearly can't fill in all of those details. But again, she takes us on a tour of what that true omniscience is, how we can access that, depending upon who we are and what we've given ourselves up to, what the nature of that is, who theosophists are that make that pursuit and truly live that life, and what they are then able to give of themselves. She explains what the valuable critics are, what the invaluable critics are. She points us to the fact that, again, theosophy can lead. You can't embrace theosophy as it's written and expect that you think you know it all. It doesn't work that way. But theosophy leads to the realization of what is true and what is real and what is immortal and what is eternal and what is always existing. What is here now, if we can only tune ourselves by turning the channel to perceive it. And she gives us the examples of those individuals that have achieved glimpses of that, degrees of that, or as she says with Plotinus, 4 or 5 times, 6 times in his life, maybe. He literally had that. And then she gives us, and this is what I'm going to end on, 2, at least in this student's view, wonderful descriptions. One is a description that she gives of Yakaburma. And this is in the glossary, so if you look up Yakaburma or just under Boheme or Bohm, B-O-E-H-M-E, you can read this point blank. But she says here, when it comes to awakening that divine instinct, he was a natural clairvoyant of most wonderful powers, Yakaburma. With no education or acquaintance with science, he wrote works which are now proved to be full of scientific truths. And for any of you that have read his works, you know that is even valid today. From the forces to the energies, to the nature of substance, to the divisions, to the properties, it's there. She then goes on to say, but then, as he says himself, what he wrote upon, he saw it as in a great deep in the eternal. He had a thorough view of the universe as in a chaos, which yet opened itself in him from time to time, as in a young plant. He was a thorough-born mystic, and evidently of a constitution which is most rare. One of those fine natures whose material envelope impedes in no way the direct, even if only occasional, intercommunication between the intellectual and the spiritual ego. It is this ego which Yakaburm, like so many other untrained mystics, and that's very telling, untrained, mistook for God. So let's read that again. It is this ego which Parabrahm, like so many other untrained mystics, mistook for God. Man must acknowledge, he writes, that his knowledge is not his own, but from God, who manifests the ideas, in italics, of wisdom to the soul of man in what measure he pleases. That's a quote. Had this great theosophist mastered Eastern occultism, he might have expressed it otherwise. He would have known then that the God who spoke through his poor, uncultured, and untrained brain was his own divine ego, the omniscient deity within himself, and that what that deity gave out was not in what measure he pleased, but in the measure of the capacities of the mortal and temporary dwelling it informed. Complete reversal. And it tells us something also, even if we look at it from the perspective of near-death experiences in individuals and that light that they experience, the love that they feel, and the being sent back, what they're really encountering from the point of view of the spiritual ego, not from the perspective of a personal God. And yet the interpretation is freely allowed to each to interpret it in what way they would like. But the experience, again, from the mystical and the occult side has a distinct cause and relationship to the personality, which is not always appreciated. And then the last one that I'll read, again, one of this student's favorites, comes from occultism versus the occult arts. And it pertains again to this divine instinct and the ability that each one has, depending upon the work that they're ready to do, to embrace this ocean of truth that is being referred to as the beacon light of truth, the beacon light of the unknown, or the truth of the beacon light of the unknown, or any other way we'd like to play with that for different information. And she says here, page 106, occultism and the occult arts. For this astral, the shadowy double, in the animal as in man, is not the companion of the divine ego, but of the earthly body. And she's italicizing divine ego and earthly body. It is the link between the personal self, the lower consciousness of manas, and the body, and is the vehicle of transitory, not of immortal life. Like the shadow projected by man, it follows his movements and impulses slavishly and mechanically, and leans therefore to matter without ever ascending to spirit. And this is the key part. It is only when the power of the passions is dead altogether, and when they have been crushed and annihilated in the retort of an unflinching will, when not only all the lusts and longings of the flesh are dead, but also the recognition of the personal self is killed out, and the astral has been reduced in consequence to a cipher, that the union with the higher self can take place. She's not giving us any exceptions there. She's laying down a set of conditions and rules. Then, when the astral, and she put that one in capital A's and quotes, reflects only the conquered man, the still living, but no more the longing, selfish personality, then the brilliant Orgoides, the divine self, can vibrate in conscious harmony with both the poles of the human entity, the man of matter purified and the ever pure spiritual soul, and stand in the presence of the Master Self, all caps, the Christos of the mystic Gnostic, blended, merged into, and one with it forever. More potent words you can't really create. On that note, we're done trying to reflect on some of her words in these 7 articles, The Beacon Light of Truth.
Thank you, Jean. Very, very much. Very, very comprehensive. Thank you so much. Will you take your first question from Judy? Looks like she's got her hand up.
Oh, sure. If I can get the reference from the book. Yes, Judy. You're muted?
Yes, I had to talk to my caregiver. The gentleman I was talking about last month is Edward Bellamy, whose idea of the religion of solidarity. He says that we have really a unity with each other and with nature, and he's very much a New England transcendentalist and utopianist in the latter part of the 19th century. I don't know if he ever met H.P. Blavatsky, but he's clearly an unconscious theosophist or a blind Chela. And he does come very close, as does Jakob Böhme, as you mentioned, to the teachings of theosophy that she writes about. I think she wrote that in French, isn't it? La Fère L'inconnu, the beacon light of the unknown. Well, then my question is, I mean, in this world, we're always going to be in some Vritti Sattva, relative truth, and getting to Paramarta Sattva would literally involve transformation of our entire being into a higher state of being. And I don't know if we'll do it in this Manvantara. We might have to wait till the 7th race in the 7th round. But does it mean that life on this planet is never going to know the Paramatma, or is it ever receding into an unknown? Because we do have the possibility of knowing more than we know, obviously.
Okay. Does it mean that, again, we can't get there, we can't know it, we can't achieve that Paramatma state, or just the awareness of it? And I think each one determines that for themselves, because if you say no, you never will. If you say yes, you will never stop trying. And either way is fine. But she tells us in the article, What is Truth, that there are those that have experienced these degrees of states. And within that, what we might call Buddhic omniscience, which is a universal state, not a personal state, there are many levels of revealings. And so if she's telling us that there are those that have achieved that, and if we just reflect on Pistis Sophia, and we remember their hierarchies of the unpassables and the insurmountables and the infinites of the infinites, etc., all pointing to those higher states within Buddhi and Atma, then we have to acknowledge that there are beings that understand this, that know this, that are experiencing this. And so each one then, if they say we can, then have to, as that last quote says, shut their mouth and live the life, and that's it. You're not looking for the reward, you're not looking for the gold, you're doing what's necessary in terms of the path. And that's really all that we're caring about, because if there's a desire there, there's still personality there. Even if it's a desire for that which we consider the highest spiritual absolute. The impersonal, which is the truth of our nature, because she tells us, if we understand the quote from the glossary about the spiritual ego and Yaka Burma, she tells us in Transactions, the spiritual ego is impersonal, period. And so as soon as we begin to touch the garment hem metaphorically, of that state, impersonality begins to consume personality. And if that centrifugal or centripetal, when a centripetal force is significant enough, we're going to be consumed in regards to the limitations of our being as it relates to the awakening to that state. And so we think it's possible. We think it's accessible. Again, even in the Mahatma letters, they say, live the life to know the teaching. And if you are filling your head with doubt, with don'ts, with can't do's, then again, that's going to be your life. If you assume the responsibility to the greatest of your ability, then you're just walking the path.
Great, thank you.
Whoops, okay, Robert and then Monica. Yes, Robert?
I've been struggling with this idea that on the one hand, the beacon light is something that you look to for direction. I mean, if you're looking at it metaphorically. But at the same time, there's the attempt to be, in some sense, a beacon light for others. So I wondered if you had any comments about how that works, about being a receiver and a broadcaster.
Okay, I mean, do we have any comments about seeking for the beacon light as if it were a thing and being a beacon light for others,
Right.
as if we could do that?
Yeah. Well,
and I mean, I'm only laughing because, you know, if we objectify the beacon light, then we've missed the boat. And if we're trying to be a beacon light for others, that's nice, but then we're not being a beacon light. We might be an example, and we can be an example in terms of our morals, our ethics, the virtues that we exercise, the altruistic behaviors. And that's what HPB spoke about in this article concerning practical theosophies. She also has that chapter in the Key to Theosophy, Practical Theosophy. And so there's a tremendous amount that we can do. Even in the Voice of the Silence, it says, if you cannot take that path of the 7 portals, you can still be an example regarding the teachings. So in that regard, you're going to be an example, a light, a positive influence, a aspirational something for someone, more than likely, if they're looking for that. And if you trust to the process and you're living the life and you have an understanding because you're studying as best you can theosophical principles, the Voice of the Silence, you're practicing according to Patanjali's, you're doing the living of the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, you're literally making that your main meal. Then again, you're not looking for the gold, you're just trying to be present with those virtues. And so again, if you're trying to be present to those virtues and you're ignorant of your personal self, that would seem to imply that you've lost a lot of your personal self, and it's only the personal self that wants the goal. So that, as HPB says in terms of theosophists, true theosophists, and other theosophists, that perhaps we can say, hey, I've got something. But none of that is really important. The change that takes place inwardly will let you know. And it will let you know by the things that you find are dying within your very being that have to do with person, personality, sense, objectivity. And she tells us that our life will automatically flip-flop. And those things that will become of value, simply of value, are those inner paths, those inner meditations, those inner contemplations, accepting the karma, understanding that, treating everyone equally to the best of your ability. And then you become the path as well as the very thing that you're seeking on the path in degrees. So when you ask me that question, there's really no dichotomy there. There's no difference there, at least the way this warped mind looks at it. Just trying to the best of your ability to live the life will put everything else in its proper place such that karma works for you. And when the doors open, the doors are open. It's up to you to be awake, to perceive that, to be thankful. And when they close, to work with what you've received. And if they open again, same process that she describes occurred with the Parabrahm. So, I mean, it's not a definitive answer, but it's just the way that this mind perceives that approach and that particular path. Monica, yes.
Thank you, Jean. This is just a wonderful presentation. Two things. The quote that you ended with about when the astral reflects the man who's conquered. Could you tell me where that's from? And I have
again, occultism and the occult arts. It's in
Oh, it's from that
article.
art.
Yeah, and if it's in the book, I think it's 106.
Okay. Thank
yeah, but that whole article, she speaks about some very interesting things. Yep, page 106, yes.
106. Okay, thank you. The other thing is, I'm trying to get a handle on the Nirmanakaya. And you spoke at the outset about how this wisdom embodied in the nature of the planetary spirits, if I understood and wrote it down correctly. And so what I'm wanting to know is, in terms of having the right understanding of what the Nirmanakaya is this a being who simply keeps the physical form so that it can have access to be of help to humanity? And if that is the case, are there different levels of the Nirmanakaya? And is this Nirmanakaya the same as the planetary spirit?
Okay, is the Nirmanakaya the same as the planetary spirit? Are there different kinds of Nirmanakayas? And does the Nirmanakaya leave their body so that they can kind of jump back and forth? Yes and no. I mean, HBB tells us there are different levels of Nirmanakayas, point blank. The same thing for the planetary spirits, the way that they're spoken about. HBB speaks about planetary spirits in the Secret Doctrine. She speaks about them in her dialogues, and she speaks about them differently. The Mahatmas speak about planetary spirits from the point of view of Sankapa, but then the teachings and the Nirmanakayas that HBB talks about as the true souls that are divine egos that consciously embody that wisdom that exists from Manvantara to Manvantara, or planetary round to planetary round, or solar, depending upon whether we're looking at global rounds or solar rounds or universal rounds. They're also different. And so really what we're looking at is a network of, as she would just say, divine egos that have achieved different levels of evolutionary unfolding through their own evolutionary development on globes, number one. And as she tells us in the dialogues, some of us will become the Kamarupas for the next rounds. Some of us will become the Kumaras, the Manasa. Some of us will, those at the very, very forefront, will become those Nirmanakayas that remain throughout the sleep of the globe in order to reintroduce the wisdom. Noah and the ark, those seeds. She speaks about the seed manus and the root manus. And so we can look at those in different ways. The Namanikaya in one of the higher senses is expressed in the voice of the silence as one who clearly has gone through the 7 portals, who has mastered the 3 perfections and has chosen the correct path. And those 3 perfections she speaks about as Titiksha, which is one of the higher states, and it is a state wherein Tanha has been obliterated.
Mm.
Then the kleshas, or the afflictions of mind, cognition, of the comic nature, all of those afflictions, all of those obscurations, all of those cognitive distortions, all of those cognitive illusions have been negated. And now we're looking at that last quote from the occultism and occult arts. We're in the astral, and we've got to be careful how that's defined, has been purified to the utmost degree. And she says, when, and this is in a different article, period, when the astral has reached that level of perfection, it cannot be destroyed as a typical astral is. And it can only be used by a mind that is commensurately as pure and as wise as that particular astral. So when we're talking about those Nirmanakayas, we're talking about those that have achieved the perfection of that 7-fold state as it relates to the astral, as it relates to the mind, and as it relates to the divine potentialities within, as she says in this article, the 6th and 7th sense. So minimally, we're talking about buddhi. Maximally, we're talking about Atma buddhi. In terms of those powers, those perceptions, the awarenesses, the causes, the laws. As she says, the adepts live in the world of force. They live in the world of cause. And we haven't even touched cause or force, even when we're looking at it from the point of view of the manifestation of the universe as we understand it from the point of view of the Big Bang. So again, the teachings open up vistas of possibilities in terms of just the divine nature of the soul and its capacity to embrace wisdom and express that wisdom as knowledge as it relates to the instructions of humanity, for the purpose of the great goal of awakening the Buddhimanas for us of this race, but in other systems for greater degrees of awakening, period.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Laura?
Well, your mentioning of the Nirmanakayas in your question, Monica, brings to mind something I was studying today on page 444 of the dialogues. And she says that the Shishtas are the highest adepts, which happen to be on a globe when a pralaya is reached. And as you mentioned, there seems to be these different degrees, and they sacrifice themselves to the human good and for cosmic purposes. And then it says they surrender or give their 3 lower principles as a ready, prepared vehicle for the coming egos of the new round.
Mm-hmm.
Then only are their monads reached. And then they are given their rest at that point in time.
Yes.
So what does it mean they give up their 3 lower principles?
And okay, so what does that mean? And I guess again in the dialogues, the Shistas are those that she refers to later on, if not in that same area, I'm not sure, as those true Nirmanakayas. And you might think of them as the higher Kumaras that could not incarnate unless the principle of desire was fully active from the bottom up to meet the astral of those that were lower than them from the top down. And then they could use that bridge to, as I think it says in the SD, to be present in the aura of the earth, yet latent, waiting for the appropriate time when their mental energies and fires could mix with, as it's expressed in the SD, the elementals of those races to bridge that gap. And then we've got if we think about the 3 lines of division that she gives us, the monadic division, the monastic division, and the lower physical psychic division. We've got monads in all of those degrees. And the lunapitries represent those lower 4. Then we've got to have those that are rajasically bridging, or so tamas, rajas, and then we've got those that are sattvic. The ahi as such are not incarnating, and the higher mental manasa are not incarnating as such. She gives us at least 7 to 10 in the SD, and she refers us to the Puranas for their differentiations and which ones are more related to the 4th principle as it relates to the astral and the lower 5th and its astral, such that they can blend, and the astral or the atmosphere or the monastic aura can merge with that and make a connection. And yet once they do that, then we can think of, and this is switching gears, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, the Dharmakaya. We understand that the Dharmakaya that is, and HPB uses this maybe once or twice, with remains, is still very much higher than the Sambhogakaya, but even the Sambhogakaya state doesn't incarnate. And yet the Nirmanakayas can take from the Sambhogakaya those 3 perfections. And in doing that, they can also sever themselves from the lower comic nature and exist within their mental sphere, like the Kumaras do. And in shedding their lower principles as such, because they've exhausted the 7-fold nature of those, they can allow them to be used as remnants for other monads that are evolving up to that point, such that there is a connection for them to move or unfold further. And when we're mentioning the monads, we've got to recognize again that HPB in the Secret Doctrine talks about those pure monads, those monads that are linking with the monastic element and the lunar monads, and then putting all of those together to create the human form with intelligence as we are familiar with it. So really that question embraces not only those particular items of the Nirmanakaya, the perfection, the seeds, the shistas, the rounds and the races, the incarnations of the lunapitries, the incarnations of the solapitries, but also those perfected elements that are present monadically and yet cannot link up with the range of experience of the globe as it exists at this point. And that you might just think of as Sambhogakaya upwards, unless they maintain that Nirmanakaic form, which is not the physical body, but that purified astral in its highest degrees or applications or interpretations, as it relates to the quote that was read from Occultism and the Occult Arts.
Well, technically our time is up, but Gina, would you be willing to stay on for a few more minutes? And
Sure, if there are any questions, yeah, I mean, we may have just blew the tube.
I have a question.
Sure.
Sure. Okay, let me find it actually. Okay, so here's a sentence from HPB's article, What is Truth? And I'm just reading it from the flyer that the quote that you gave to Truth, for the flyer.
Right.
And here it says, outside a certain highly spiritual and elevated state of mind, during which man is at one with the universal mind, he can get naught on earth but relative truth or truths from whatsoever philosophy or religion. And you've talked about living the life, and I'm thinking of like the question is going to be having to do with how would a person put this into practice, the abhyasa side of this. And you've been touching on this all along. But in other words, becoming at one with the universal mind is thinking about universal ideas part of that? Is there, what would be the moral component of that, becoming at one with universal mind? So there's two questions.
Okay, two questions. What would be the moral component of that? I mean, how do we do that? How do we make that practical? And that just lines up with the first fundamental, universal brother and sisterhood of all sentient life, period. If we're living to the best of our ability as that one life, again, we're accomplishing all aspects. I mean, the one life, as they've described it, is the imperishable, immortal root that gives rise to all differentiation. And so if we look at the idea of Shista that Laura just mentioned as it relates to Nirmanakaya, there's a Shista or a seed of life that holds the potentiality for the unfolding of all things. You can call it the logoic vision, the vision that's inherent in that Devi Prakritic light, the light of the logos. That is a state, again, that is attainable. It can open up in peaks or whatever. But if we are living from that universal perspective to the greatest of our ability, and we're not seeking for a temporal truth, but simply trying to open ourselves up to embrace as much of that boundless as we can, then when those glimpses come in, they won't disrupt and create, as she says in this article, insanity and aberrations. But because there's no personality there with limited structures, boundaries, beliefs, it's me, it's not them, they don't have it, this and that and the other, none of that chaos gets stirred up.
Mm-hmm.
And the more empty we are, as much as perhaps as frightening as that is to many people, the less we have of self, the more we realize of truth. And so we're living in two worlds at one time. We can think about during the day when we want to conceptualize in dichotomous thinking what is universal versus what is relative. But at the same time, as she tells us in this article, we've got to take both sides, and we've got to realize that what is relative is universal. And so even during the day, as we build up structures, we're demolishing them with universality. We're saturating them with universality. So if I want something, it's everyone's hunger. We can't carry that out, but the more it's in our minds and the more it becomes part of our consciousness, the more we begin to act on that. And we realize that we're literally giving ourselves up. There is nothing that we can possibly want because everything is fully present in the universal. There are things that we do, we have to go through the motions, we're not any different than anyone else, as she says with the adepts on the outside. But that world on the inside is of a reality that most people have no idea of and wouldn't know how to swim in without going perhaps psychotic, because the very boundaries that they've constructed in their minds would have to be destroyed. And so the morals, the ethics, the virtues, the more we're living the morals, the ethics, and the virtues from a universal perspective, the more we're using that second object to open up our understanding, the more we don't limit what we are evolutionarily, but allow ourselves to unfold naturally, the more we are returning to the original condition that we are. And that becomes a living process. That becomes a living of the life in the service of whoever, for whatever, whenever, however, to the best of our ability.
Laura's got her hand up.
Yeah, that
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Laura?
everything that you just said answers to the comment that Mr. Judge makes, that it's important that we work as a body of students in studying theosophy, not
Mhm.
just by ourselves, but everything. So when we present ideas and they're deconstructed by others, then we can reassess them and build those ideas and rebuild them again. And
Mhm.
that being part of a body of students, I think, also protects one from that insanity that you talked about.
Yes.
That it's
Yes.
very important, and that we take the position of being student teachers all the time.
Right. Indeed. Thank you. And she mentions that in this article, in terms of those that would study occult principles, again, 3 to 7 in number, odd numbers, she says. But then as she begins to talk more about that, she says, I think I'm going too far, because you actually need a teacher to select the odd number of students in order to make the greatest difference in the most positive flow. And yet, we'll also have to recognize that there are times when each one has to spend time alone. And whether that's in retreat, sometimes for years, similar to the Buddha's path or whatever, I think it's also mentioned in the voice that one has to remain in their own atmosphere in order to prepare it for certain processes, transformations, and changes. And COVID did that for everybody to a great degree, So yes, there's both there, definitely working in groups. And she says the selfish ones that are the selfish yogis or the pratyeka yogis, etc., that want to realize this and then go on their own way without coming back, are the very ones that are at a loss. And so it is about sharing with the group. It is about sharing with humanity. It is about being, as you say, a student teacher and just trying. And when the opportunity arises, to present a piece of that to the best of one's ability.
Well, thank you, Jean. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, this idea of sharing and studying together. And also, as you say, studying independently, and it's kind of a dialectic. There's the independent study, and then there's the shared study. And as was mentioned, the value of the deconstruct that happens with the shared study, because you get a different point of view.
Right.
And that's one of the magnificent things about the second object, by the way, is that you study all these different teachers, Shankaracharya, Plato, Burma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a different mindset, different vibration, and yet it's all the same
Right.
light, really.